The smell of burnt metal still hung in the cargo bay when Daniel Hart walked in that day, carrying a toolbox that was heavier than it should have been. Nobody greeted him. Nobody ever did. On this station, humans cleaned pipes, fixed wires, and carried crates while the other species walked past like he was part of the furniture. He was used to it by now. 3 years on this station had taught him to keep his head down and his hands busy. He was halfway through fixing a broken air vent when Rask found him. Rask was a Vorthan, tall, gray-skinned, with a wide grin that never meant anything good. He had a small crate under one arm, and he was walking with the kind of swagger that told Daniel something was wrong before a single word was spoken. "Hart," Rask said, dropping the crate at Daniel's feet. "Got something for you." Daniel wiped his hands on his overalls and looked at the crate. It was small, barely bigger than a shoebox, with holes cut into the sides. Something inside was breathing, slow and ragged. "What is it?" "A pet," Rask said, and behind him, 2 other Vorthans laughed quietly. "Found it in a shipment that went bad. Poor thing's dying anyway. Thought a human should have something to take care of, since you're all so good at cleaning up messes." Daniel didn't laugh. He knelt down and opened the crate slowly. Inside, curled into a tight, shivering ball, was a small creature covered in dark scales that looked too big for its thin body. Its wings, still wet and folded close, twitched weakly. Its eyes were shut. Its breathing came in short, painful bursts. "What is it?" Daniel asked again, quieter this time. Rask shrugged. "Does it matter? It'll be dead by morning. Have fun, Hart." The Vorthans walked off, still laughing, leaving Daniel alone with the crate and the fading heartbeat inside it. He should have felt anger. Instead, he felt something else, a strange pull he couldn't explain. He looked closer at the little creature. Its scales had a faint shimmer to them, like they were catching light that wasn't even there. Whatever this animal was, it wasn't ordinary. He carried the crate back to his quarters that night, ignoring the stares from crewmates in the hallway. His room was small, barely enough space for a bed and a desk, but he cleared the desk off and set the crate down carefully. The creature hadn't moved. Its breathing was getting slower. Daniel had no idea what to do. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a scientist. He was a technician who fixed pipes and wires, not living things. But he couldn't just watch it die without trying something. He remembered the station had a small medical bay for emergencies, mostly meant for humans since the other species had their own separate facilities. He grabbed a thermal blanket and a heating pad meant for sore joints and rushed there, hoping nobody would ask questions. Luckily, the night shift was quiet. Back in his room, he wrapped the creature loosely in the warm blanket, careful not to press on its wings. He mixed a bit of protein paste from his ration kit with water, thinning it until it was almost like a liquid, and used a small dropper from his first aid kit to place drops near its mouth. At first, nothing happened. The creature didn't stir. Daniel sat back on his heels, feeling foolish. Maybe Rask was right. Maybe this was a waste of time. But then, faintly, he saw the tiny chest rise, and fall, and rise again, just a little stronger than before. He kept at it through the night, warming water, adjusting the blanket, offering small drops of the paste whenever the creature's mouth twitched, even slightly. He didn't sleep. He barely noticed the hours passing. Somewhere around the 4th hour, the creature's eyes cracked open for just a second, revealing a strange golden color, before closing again. By the time the artificial morning lights of the station clicked on, the creature was still alive. Weak, but alive. Its breathing had steadied. Its small body had relaxed slightly against the warmth of the blanket. Daniel stared down at it, exhausted but strangely proud. He had no idea what kind of animal this was, whether it would survive the day, or what he would even do with it if it did. All he knew was that something had looked ready to die in his hands last night, and it hadn't. Not yet. He gently closed the crate, careful to leave the holes uncovered so it could breathe, and got ready for his shift, moving slower than usual from the lack of sleep. As he stepped into the hallway, he passed Rask, who smirked at him. "Still alive?" Rask asked, clearly expecting a different answer. Daniel met his eyes, steady and calm. "Yeah," he said. "Still alive." Rask's smirk faltered just slightly, though he covered it quickly and walked away. Daniel didn't know it yet, but that small, shivering creature in his room was about to change everything he thought he knew about himself, about strength, and about what it meant to matter on a station where nobody had ever expected anything from him at all. 3 days passed before Daniel worked up the nerve to ask for help. He had kept the creature alive through careful feeding and warmth, but it wasn't getting stronger fast enough, and he was running out of ideas. That was how he found himself standing outside the door of Dr. Sella's small lab, a crate tucked under his arm, and his heart beating faster than he wanted to admit. Dr. Sella was a Coelith, a species known for their calm nature and sharp minds. She had pale blue skin and quiet eyes that seemed to notice everything. She wasn't unkind to humans, which already made her different from most of the crew. When Daniel explained what had happened, she raised a brow and asked to see the creature. The moment she opened the crate, her expression changed completely. She went very still. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Daniel shook his head. "No idea. Rasp just dumped it on me and said it would die." Dr. Sella reached out, hesitating before gently touching one of the small wings. "This is a Dravex hatchling. Do you understand what that means?" Daniel didn't, and he said so. The Dravex are one of the rarest and most respected species in this part of the galaxy, she explained. They're not officially a species that others own or tame. They choose their bonds, if they bond at all. Most attempts to raise a Dravex from hatching fail because the creature has to trust its caretaker completely, or it simply gives up and dies. I've read about them in old records. I've never seen one in person, not even in a research facility. Daniel looked down at the small creature, now sleeping peacefully in its blanket, its breathing steady for the first time since he'd found it. "So it's special." "It's more than special," Dr. Sella said. "If it survives, and if it truly bonds with you, you could be looking at one of the most powerful allies any being in this galaxy can have." Dravex are fiercely loyal, incredibly strong, and highly intelligent. But if you fail even once to protect its trust, it may never fully bond, and it could remain sickly its whole life, or worse. That night, Daniel returned to his quarters with new information and a heavier sense of responsibility. Dr. Sella had given him proper information on Dravex care, including details on temperature, feeding schedules, and how to read the small changes in body language that showed comfort or fear. It wasn't much, since so little was known about the species, but it was more than he'd had before. He started following the new instructions carefully, adjusting the heat levels, changing the mixture of food, and spending time simply sitting near the creature, letting it grow used to his presence. Slowly but surely, it began to respond. Its breathing grew steadier. Its scales, once dull, started to develop a faint shine, catching the light of his small room in flickers of deep green and black. One evening, about a week after Dr. Sella's visit, the creature opened its eyes fully for the first time and looked directly at him. Golden eyes, sharp and curious, studied his face for a long moment. Daniel stayed perfectly still, unsure what to do. Then, slowly, the small creature shifted closer to him and pressed its head against his hand. Something in Daniel's chest tightened. It wasn't just relief. It felt like something had shifted between them, something he couldn't explain with words. Word had begun to spread around the station about the human who was keeping a strange pet in his quarters. Most of the crew laughed it off, assuming it was some kind of joke that would end badly. Rask, in particular, seemed to enjoy telling anyone who would listen how he'd handed Daniel a dying animal as a prank, expecting it to die within hours. But not everyone found it funny. Commander Yulin, a stern Kethari officer who ran the station with an iron routine, called Daniel into his office one afternoon to ask what exactly was going on. "I've heard rumors," Yulin said bluntly. "A creature in your quarters. Some kind of animal Rask found in a damaged shipment." Daniel explained everything as clearly as he could, including what Dr. Sella had told him about the Dravex. Yulin studied him carefully, arms crossed. "If this creature truly is a Dravex, and it bonds with you, it changes things. Dravex aren't just pets. They're forces of nature. I expect you to keep this under control, Hart. No surprises." "Understood, sir," Daniel said, though inside, he wasn't entirely sure he could promise that. Back in his quarters that night, he sat beside the crate, now often left open since the creature preferred to stay close to him rather than hide inside it. He watched it breathe, steady and calm, and thought about everything Dr. Sella had told him. He didn't fully understand what he was raising or what it might become, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever this creature was, it had chosen to keep living. And somehow, without meaning to, Daniel had chosen to keep fighting for it too. By the end of the second month, the creature had grown far too large for the small crate Daniel once used to carry it. It now stood almost as tall as his knee, with dark green scales that shimmered like polished stone under the station lights, and wings that had grown strong enough to stretch fully across his small quarters. Daniel had given it a name by then. He called it Talon, mostly because of the way its claws had grown sharp and curved, but also because the name simply felt right. Talon followed him everywhere it was allowed to go. It waited outside the maintenance bay during his shifts, curled near the door like a loyal guard. It slept beside his bed at night, its steady breathing the only sound in the quiet room. And it watched him constantly, golden eyes tracking his every move with a kind of intelligence Daniel hadn't expected from an animal, if Talon could even be called simply an animal anymore. The crew's reaction had shifted too, though not entirely in Daniel's favor. Some were curious, keeping their distance, but clearly impressed by how much the creature had grown in such a short time. Others were nervous, especially as Talon's size and strength became harder to ignore. A few still mocked Daniel behind his back, calling him the pet keeper, or joking that a human finally found something even more useless than himself to care for. Daniel ignored most of it. He'd learned to. But one afternoon, in the middle of the busy central hub of the station, an incident happened that changed how people looked at him and Talon for good. A group of Vorthan crew members, drinking during their off hours, had grown loud and aggressive. One of them, a large male named Brecht, had taken to shoving smaller crew members out of his way as he stumbled through the hub. When Daniel walked past with Talon beside him, Brecht sneered and shoved Daniel hard enough to knock him into a support beam. "Watch where you're going, human," Brecht growled, stepping closer, clearly looking for a reason to cause trouble. What happened next silenced the entire hub. Talon, who had been calmly walking beside Daniel just seconds before, let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the metal floor itself. Its wings flared out, doubling its size in an instant, and its golden eyes locked onto Brecht with an intensity that made the Vorthan freeze mid-step. "Talon, easy," Daniel said quickly, stepping between them, one hand raised toward the creature. Talon didn't attack. It didn't need to. The growl alone, combined with its sudden change in posture, was enough to make Brecht take several stumbling steps back, his earlier bravado completely gone. The rest of the hub had gone quiet, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "Just walking," Brecht muttered, quickly turning and disappearing into the crowd, his friends following close behind, no longer laughing. Daniel knelt down beside Talon, running a hand along its neck until the growling stopped and its wings folded back down. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm okay." Talon pressed its head against his shoulder, the golden eyes softening as it calmed. Around them, the hub slowly returned to its normal noise, though the whispers that followed carried a very different tone than before. Dr. Sella had witnessed the entire event from a nearby corridor, and she approached Daniel once the crowd thinned out. "That kind of protective instinct, this early in its life, is extremely rare," she said, watching Talon closely. "Most Dravex don't show that level of loyalty until they're fully grown, if ever. Whatever you're doing, Daniel, it's working better than anyone could have expected." Daniel wasn't sure what he was doing differently. He hadn't followed any grand plan. He simply spent time with Talon, fed it, talked to it, even when it couldn't understand the words, and made sure it always felt safe. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that was all it had ever needed. Not everyone was pleased with the growing bond. Rask, who had started the entire situation as a joke months ago, found himself watching from a distance more and more often, his usual smirk replaced by something closer to discomfort. He hadn't expected any of this. He hadn't expected the creature to survive, let alone grow into something that made even seasoned crew members nervous. One evening, as Daniel walked past the engineering bay, he noticed Rask standing near the entrance, watching him and Talon pass. For once, Rask didn't say anything mocking. He just watched, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking back inside without a word. Daniel didn't think much of it at the time. He had no way of knowing that the guilt quietly building in Rask would eventually change the course of everything that was still to come, or that the bond between him and Talon was about to be tested in a way neither of them could have prepared for. The alarms tore through the station without warning, red lights flashing down every corridor as a voice repeated the same emergency message over and over. Daniel had been halfway through repairing a fuel line when the sound hit, and for a moment, he simply froze, trying to understand what was happening. Talon, resting nearby, was on its feet instantly, wings half spread, a low growl building in its throat. The message became clear soon enough. Unknown ships had entered the station's docking range, ignoring all communication attempts, and were now forcing their way through a secondary airlock. Raiders, the kind that targeted stations like this one for valuable tech, fuel reserves, and anything else they could strip and sell. Daniel grabbed the nearest tool bag, more out of instinct than any real plan, and moved toward the main corridor with Talon close behind him. Around him, crew members ran in different directions, some heading toward defense stations, others simply trying to find somewhere safe to hide. The station wasn't built for this kind of attack. It was a research and trade outpost, not a military base, and it showed in the chaos spreading through every level. He reached the central hub just as the first group of raiders broke through a side door, heavily armored and armed with weapons that looked far more advanced than anything the station's small security team carried. Shots rang out immediately, and several crew members scrambled for cover behind overturned crates and support beams. Daniel pulled a group of frightened lab workers, none of them fighters, into a side room and tried to seal the door behind them. But the lock mechanism had been damaged during the initial breach. He was stuck, half in the doorway, trying to force it closed, when one of the raiders spotted him and raised a weapon. Everything happened fast after that. Talon moved before Daniel even had time to react, launching itself between him and the raider with a speed that seemed impossible for a creature of its size. The blast meant for Daniel struck Talon's shoulder instead, and the creature let out a sharp cry but didn't fall. If anything, the pain seemed to fuel it. Talon's wings snapped open fully, and with one powerful motion, it knocked the raider backward into a wall hard enough to crack the metal paneling. Before the raider could recover, Talon was on him, and the fight, brief and brutal, ended almost as quickly as it began. More raiders poured into the hub, and Daniel realized quickly that hiding wasn't going to be an option anymore. He grabbed a fallen weapon from the ground, something he barely knew how to use, and pointed it toward the nearest threat, more out of desperation than skill. "Get behind me," he shouted to the group of lab workers still huddled in the doorway. What followed wasn't graceful. Daniel wasn't a soldier, and it showed in every clumsy shot he fired. Every moment he ducked a half-second too late. But he didn't run. He stayed between the raiders and the people he was protecting, using crates and broken equipment as cover, buying time however he could. Beside him, Talon fought with a ferocity that seemed to grow with every passing minute, using its size, claws, and raw strength to tear through the chaos in ways the raiders clearly hadn't expected from a station like this. Commander Yulin arrived with a small group of armed security officers partway through the fight, and together with Daniel's makeshift defense, they managed to push the raiders back toward the breached airlock. It wasn't a clean victory. Several crew members were injured, and the damage to the station would take weeks to repair. But the raiders, faced with losses they hadn't planned for, retreated back to their ships and disengaged, disappearing back into open space as quickly as they'd arrived. In the aftermath, the central hub was filled with groaning machinery, scattered debris, and the quiet murmur of shaken crew members checking on each other. Daniel sat against a broken crate, exhausted, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline finally leaving his body. Talon lay beside him, breathing heavily, a nasty burn mark visible on its shoulder where the earlier blast had struck. Dr. Sella rushed over as soon as she was able, immediately checking Talon's injury, while a medical team saw to Daniel and the others. "It's not life-threatening," she said after a quick examination, relief clear in her voice. "But it took that hit for you." Daniel reached out and gently rested a hand on Talon's neck. "I know," he said quietly. Commander Yulin approached shortly after, his expression harder to read than usual. He looked at the damage around them, then at Daniel, then at Talon resting nearby. "You held that hallway," he said finally. "Without proper training, without proper weapons. You held it." "I wasn't alone," Daniel said, glancing at Talon. Yulin studied the creature for a long moment. "No," he admitted. "You weren't." Word of what happened in the central hub spread through the station within hours, growing more detailed and more impressive with every retelling. By the next day, even those who had mocked Daniel the longest were looking at him differently, and Talon, exhausted but recovering, had become something the entire station now saw as more than just a strange pet from a cruel joke months ago. News traveled faster through space than most people expected, especially news about something as rare as a bonded Dravex. Within 2 weeks of the raider attack, Daniel began noticing unfamiliar faces on the station, visitors who claimed to be traders or researchers, but who spent far more time watching him and Talon than doing any actual business. Dr. Sella explained it plainly one afternoon while checking on Talon's healing shoulder. A confirmed Dravex bond hasn't been recorded in nearly 2 centuries. People are curious. Some are skeptical. A few are probably hoping to find a way to profit from it. Daniel didn't like the idea of being watched, but there wasn't much he could do to stop it. Talon had grown even more protective since the attack, rarely leaving his side, and the attention only seemed to make the creature more alert, its golden eyes tracking every stranger that got too close. The biggest test of this growing attention came when a formal delegation arrived from a neighboring system, led by an elderly Dravex researcher named Orenvale, one of the few remaining experts on the species left in known space. He was smaller than Daniel expected, with pale, weathered skin and sharp eyes that studied everything around him with quiet intensity. "I've spent 40 years studying old records of the Dravex," Oren said, standing in the same hub where the battle had taken place weeks earlier, now fully repaired. "I never expected to see one in person, let alone bonded to a human." He approached slowly, and Talon, though alert, didn't growl or step back, seeming to sense that this visitor meant no harm. Oren knelt carefully in front of the creature, studying its scales, its eyes, the way it positioned itself protectively near Daniel. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The trust here isn't forced or trained. This is a true bond. I've read about this happening before, centuries ago, but always assumed those records were exaggerated legend." "What made it happen?" Daniel asked. He'd wondered the same thing many times since that first night with the dying hatchling. Oren looked up at him, considering the question carefully. "Patience, most likely. Compassion, given without expecting anything back. Dravex are not creatures that respond well to command or control. They respond to sincerity. From what I understand, you gave that to this creature when it had nothing else." The formal recognition ceremony that followed a few days later was smaller than Daniel expected, but it still felt strange to stand in front of representatives from several different worlds, all gathered to witness Oren officially confirm the bond between Daniel and Talon in the station's historical records. Commander Yulin stood nearby, along with Dr. Sella, both looking on with quiet pride that surprised Daniel more than the ceremony itself. Rask was there too, standing near the back of the small crowd. After the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, he approached Daniel hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable but determined to say something. "I didn't think it would live," Rask admitted, glancing at Talon, who watched him with calm golden eyes rather than the earlier hostility he'd shown toward strangers. "I gave it to you because I wanted to watch you fail. I'm sorry, Hart. I mean it." Daniel studied him for a moment. He hadn't forgotten the cruelty of that first day, but he also hadn't forgotten how far things had come since then. "You gave me the chance to try," Daniel said finally. "What I did with it was my choice. But thank you for saying that." Rask nodded, looking almost relieved, and for the first time since they'd met, he offered a genuine smile instead of a smirk. "If you ever need help with anything involving that thing's care, or, well, anything else, I'd like to make it up to you." It wasn't a complete transformation, and Daniel knew trust like that would take time to rebuild fully. But it was a start, and given everything else that had happened over the past few months, a start felt like enough. Later that evening, Commander Yulin called Daniel into his office one more time, offering him a formal position within the station's newly expanded defense team, citing his actions during the raider attack and the undeniable value of his bond with Talon. It was a significant offer, one that came with better quarters, better pay, and far more respect than Daniel had ever expected to receive on this station. Daniel considered it carefully before answering. "I'll take it," he said, "but only if it's clear that Talon isn't a weapon. He's not a tool for the station to use. He's family." Yulin studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Understood, Hart. Welcome aboard, officially." As Daniel walked back through the station that night, Talon at his side as always, he thought about how far they'd both come since that first desperate night with a dying hatchling and a stolen heating pad. Nobody had expected this outcome, least of all Daniel himself. But somehow, against every joke, every doubt, and every low expectation placed on him, he had built something the entire station now looked at with respect instead of ridicule. A full year had passed since the night Daniel first opened that small crate and found a dying hatchling curled inside it. The station looked different now, rebuilt stronger after the Raider attack, its defense systems upgraded, its crew more prepared for whatever might come through the docking bay unannounced. And walking through its corridors, few people looked twice at the sight that had once drawn stares and whispered jokes. A human and a massive Dravex moving side by side like it was the most natural thing in the galaxy. Talon had grown enormous, easily the size of a small transport vehicle, with dark green scales that shimmered like polished armor under the station lights. Its wingspan alone was enough to make newcomers step back in surprise the first time they saw it stretch. Yet despite its size and strength, it remained exactly as it always had been with Daniel, calm, loyal, and quick to press its head against his shoulder whenever he sat down to rest after a long shift. Daniel had changed too, though not in ways that were immediately obvious. He still spoke quietly, still preferred to listen more than talk, but there was a steadiness to him now that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence earned through months of proving himself when nobody expected him to. He led the station's expanded defense team, a role he'd grown into naturally, using patience and clear thinking rather than aggression to guide even the most stubborn crew members through difficult situations. Rask had become one of his closest allies on the station, a strange turn of events considering how their relationship had started. The guilt he'd carried after that first cruel prank had shaped him into someone far more thoughtful, and he often found himself defending Daniel and Talon to newcomers who hadn't yet heard the full story, retelling it with a kind of pride that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. On a quiet evening, the station received word of a formal gathering being held on a nearby world, an event meant to bring together representatives from several systems to discuss growing tensions with Raider factions that had become bolder in recent months. Commander Yulin, now considering Daniel one of his most trusted officers, asked him to attend as a representative of the station, given both his experience during the earlier attack and the undeniable weight his bond with Talon carried among those who knew of it. Daniel accepted, though he made it clear from the start that he wasn't interested in being treated as some kind of legend or symbol. He simply wanted to help however he could, the same way he had from the very beginning. The gathering itself was tense, filled with representatives arguing over resources, defense strategies, and how best to handle the growing Raider threat across the region. It was during a particularly heated discussion that word arrived of an active Raider assault on a smaller, less protected outpost nearby, one without the defenses or the warning systems that Daniel's station now had in place. Without hesitation, Daniel volunteered to lead a small response team, Talon at his side as always. What followed was a tense, fast journey through open space, arriving just as the situation at the smaller outpost had grown dire, its limited defenses nearly overwhelmed. The battle that followed was chaotic, but Daniel moved through it with a calm he hadn't possessed a year earlier, directing his team with clear instructions while Talon fought alongside him, protecting vulnerable crew members and pushing back Raiders with a strength that had only grown since their first fight together. Between Daniel's steady leadership and Talon's raw power, the outpost was successfully defended, the Raiders driven off before real damage could be done. Word of the rescue spread quickly, adding to the growing reputation Daniel and Talon had built over the past year. But when he returned to his own station afterward, exhausted but unharmed, Daniel didn't dwell on the praise or the recognition. He simply sat with Talon in their quarters, the same small space that had once barely fit a crate and a dying hatchling, now filled with mementos and gifts from grateful crew members across the region. Dr. Sella visited that evening, as she often did, checking on Talon out of habit more than necessity at this point. "You know," she said, watching the massive creature curl comfortably beside Daniel despite the tight space. "When Rask first brought that hatchling to you, nobody believed it would survive the week." "I remember," Daniel said quietly. "Do you ever think about how differently things could have gone?" she asked. If you just said no. If you'd let it go the way everyone expected. Daniel looked down at Talon, now resting peacefully, golden eyes half closed in contentment. He thought about that first night, the shaking, dying creature in his hands, the exhaustion, the doubt, and the quiet decision to keep trying anyway, simply because it felt like the right thing to do. I think about it sometimes, he admitted. But I don't think I ever really had a choice. Not really. Dr. Sella smiled and said nothing more, leaving him to the quiet evening. Outside their small quarters, the station carried on as it always did, filled with the low hum of machinery and distant voices in the corridors. But within those walls, something rare and enduring had taken root, born from a cruel joke that had somehow, against every expectation, grown into a living legend.